What's up, guys? This is Pete, aka Poker Coach Instructor Characters. Welcome back to the Carrot Poker Podcast. Continuing our foray through the excellent hands posted on Carrot Corner to do some instructive review again today. I'm a day late with this podcast, so apologies for that. I did swear last time an oath to produce one every week on a Thursday or a Friday. This is Saturday, but I had a day of hanging out with friends and catching up and stuff last night, so didn't really get the chance to record as I planned to, but oh well. One day late I can hopefully be forgiven for, but I'll try and get these out every Friday from now on. Right, so let's jump into a couple of hands today. I'll try and get a couple done this time, but I do not want to scrimp on detail as usual. For anyone who's not familiar with this format, what we are doing is going through the Carrot Corner Poker Forum, which exists on Google+, and is a private forum exclusive to either people who have got a coaching package with me or other players who would like to join the forum for a one-off fee are also able to do that. So it's a serious forum moderated by myself and 3 or 4 poker players who I've coached and currently respect the game of a lot based on how much they've improved over the last few years. And basically there's just always activity, lots of feedback on this forum, very good attitude as well. If you're looking for a positive, friendly place to learn poker for a one-off fee or as part of hiring me as a coach, then the Carrot Corner Forum is definitely the place to go. We have sweats, we have video reviews, we have hand histories all the time, we have lots of stuff, and more importantly, there's never any animosity, arrogance, ego battles, bad advice that doesn't get corrected, dubious or ambiguous advice like just fold or anything like that. We don't do that. We do like everyone's trained to post hands in a really full detailed way, and everyone's trained to give responses in a really full detailed way. So this is the place to go if you are academically very serious about improving your game and want to avoid the bullshit that is mainstream forums and all the bravado and lies and internet keyboard warrior battling and all that kind of shit that exists unfortunately in other places. We cut that out here at Carrot Corner. Anyway, let's start with a hand posted by one of my newer students, and this hand is entitled "Can We Call This River Overbet with Top Pair?" So right away when you see the title, the answer is obviously we don't know, because we don't know what the hand is yet. So first thing to say here is that there are no like ridiculous conclusions to jump to, like you should never call a river overbet with anything weaker than 2 pair, or you know, river overbets are always weak or anything like this. Just avoid any kind of temptation to make ridiculous assumptions about river overbets. It depends on the villain, but I will say in general at lower stakes, and this hand comes from 2NL, that river overbets from regs are very seldom bluffs, but from aggro fish or whatever they certainly could be. So let's take a look at who the player is first. So the guy who makes the overbet is the small blind, and the small blind stats are 100, 100, with a 100 3-bet over, you guessed it, one hand. So do we know nothing about villain? No, we know something. We know that so far he has 3-bet. Does this mean that he is likely to be active? Only slightly more likely to be active than someone who hasn't over one hand. If you look at like all the players who have these stats over one hand, you will see a slight weighting towards more aggressive players based on a sample of like 0-0 over one hand, or 0-0 over 0 hands, or unknown data over 0 hands I should say. So the point is that even though this is only one hand, it does kind of suggest slightly that villain is more likely than not to be aggro, which means that if the spot is very close, you have something to sway you one direction rather than the other. And really vague, kind of unreliable bits of information like that should only be called upon when all the reliable bits of information lead you to a kind of conundrum where it's close one way or the other, basically. So hero is on the button here, and there are 3 folds to hero at a 6 max table, and hero opens to 2 big blinds. This is 2NL, but I'm going to work in the currency of big blinds because that's the format the hand is posted in, and I don't want to confuse my brain because I'm slightly hungover today. So hero raises to 2 big blinds, the small blind calls 1.5 big blinds, and big blind calls 1 big blind. So we go 3-way to the flop. Big blind stats, by the way, are 22, 22 over 9 hands. What can you infer from that? Well, very likely not to be a fish, or to be some kind of taggy, tighter, reggy player. It would just be unlikely for like a 55-11 to run 22, 22 over 9 hands. It's actually near impossible just based on the way he plays. Not near impossible, but pretty damn unlikely. Okay, so hero has queen 10, queen of clubs, queen 10 of diamonds, and opens to 2 big blinds. Gets called twice. Flop comes down. There's 6 BBs in the pot in the hand history. Probably less than that in the actual hand due to rake, but whatever. The flop is Jack 7-6 with 2 diamonds, so hero flop's basically a backdoor straight draw, Queen Jack 10, 3-card wrap, I guess, and a backdoor 10 high diamond flush draw to the 10 of diamonds, which is obviously not very valuable. So hero's not flopped great here. He's 3-way, he does have absolute position. One of the villains does have a kind of, there's more of a likelihood that one of the players is like a more active fish, but it's a very slight likelihood, so it's not much to read into. The other guy's a reg. So first question is, do we c-bet this Jack 7-6 flop when it checks round to us? Well, Jack 7-6 two-tone is not the driest, not the wettest board in the world. It falls somewhere in the middle. Heads up, this makes for a very comfortable c-bet here. I feel that 3-way, a c-bet isn't likely to be too bad, but I also think that it's a little bit on the dodgy side just when one player already gives the appearance of being a fish, and this guy also is flatted out of the small blind, which you need to remember, and fish are way more likely to flat a button open from the small blind than regs are. Hero actually writes pre-flop here, sorry to skip all over the hand, I just want to jump back to cover Hero's thoughts pre-flop. He says, not much to say here, can we read into the small blind's call as a fishy play at all? Well, not really, because you are playing at 2NL where regs don't really understand that they shouldn't flat out the small blind very much. So again, we just have two things, the 100-100 over one hand, and the fact that he called out the small blind, that lead us to think that he's more likely to be a fish than usual, and given this is 2NL and there's a higher ratio of fish to regs and there are at higher stakes, it's fairly likely that this guy is a fish. So you've gone 3-way here to the flop with one player who's quite likely to be a fish. I feel that your equity is a little bit insufficient here to start betting. It might not be too bad if you were to bet like half pot here. The EV of that bet is probably maybe scraping positive, like it's not going to be much in it. I don't think if you make it a 3 big blind bet into 6 big blinds, your required fold equity there is 33%, but you can deduct a little bit from that based on your pot equity. So you could say like high 20s, early 30s, somewhere around there folds. You're going to need to break even on that bet. Now, just breaking even on the bet or doing slightly better than breaking even on a bet in a vacuum due to meeting this required fold equity target for the bluff is not a sufficient criterion for betting the flop. All it means is that it's plus EV. It doesn't mean it's the most plus EV line. Now, obviously, if Hero checks back here, it's far from 0 EV because he's seeing a turn card, he can hit his queen or his 10, he can improve his equity, he can possibly get fold equity on the turn, because if it checks through twice on a blank turn, it's now more likely that no one has a jack, a flush draw, pocket 8s, a 7, a gut shot, an open ender, hands that they're certainly calling or raising on the flop, set, 2 pair, you name it. So I prefer a delayed c-bet here. I think that if it checks through to you twice, you have a lot more fold equity there. Sure, sometimes like a player will lead at this and pick up the pot, but I think the reg and the big blind will be somewhat hesitant about bluffing 3-way when there's a likely fish in the hand. He may even know more than we do if we're new to the table. Villain might be a confirmed fish, who knows. But I think that the big blind reg, or likely reg, is going to be fairly fit or fold on average at 2NL and a 3-way pot on a semi-wet board. And the small blind, you know, just because someone is a weaker player doesn't mean that they're going to just stab lots of stuff and take the pot down. So I think that your fold equity is fairly protected here. And what I mean by that is that the majority of the fold equity you have on the flop, a lot of it will remain on the turn, and you get that benefit of not investing a c-bet right away and, you know, burning money the times you just run into a hand. Like your 3-way, multi-wayness in the Grounder's Manual in my book is like one of the factors stipulated for making c-bets a worse idea in a vacuum. And here I just want to make a quick point regarding vacuum play, and that is that it's absolutely fine to play in a vacuum here. You're at 2-0 limit, you're in a 3-way pot, so the burden of balance is kind of split between all the players anyway, so I mean it's going to be hard for people to exploit you in a 3-way pot, so you don't need to worry as much about that. And one of the players is probably weaker as well, so I think we can just infer that we can play our hand in a vacuum and not really think too much about a balance strategy here. I don't think it's very important to go down that route at this point. So we just basically need to decide if checking flop is higher EV than betting flop. And I think it probably is just about, if your head's up, then it's way more likely you get led into on the turn and lose the pot that way with your queen high. It's way more likely that your c-bet just picks up lots of fold equity. So, and it's way more likely that you're going to get fold equity later in the hand by barreling, because you're going to run into, on average, less top pair and stuff when your c-bet gets called. Heads up. So heads up, I'm fine with c-betting here. 3-way, I think that you need slightly better backdoor draws. If you maybe had a hand like with the ace, something with the ace of diamonds in it with 2 overcards, like ace queen with ace of diamonds, I prefer that you're just going to turn way better flush draws. I'm not really happy barreling a 10 high flush draw into a weaker player or even a 2NL reg on what was a fairly wet board that was c-bet 3-way. I just think that your fold equity and pot equity won't be great there. There are some good turns, granted, if you do bet your queen 10 on this jack 7-6 board, like a king or an ace, or a queen, but I don't think they're really abundant enough, and you do still hit those turns if you check flop as well and can still get some value that way. So I think flop is a check. I think it's close. I think the biggest mistake that Hero makes on the flop is that he bets 4 big blinds, which I feel like into 6 in a 3-way pot here is a little bit too big. Like, the board is a bit wetter, but I'd probably go with something like 350 here. Just shave half a big blind or maybe even a whole big blind off of this and give yourself a better price to pick up the pot. Like, I think that a random fish is going to be quite inelastic with his continuing range on this flop, so that's to say that there's not much give there based on your sizing as to how much he folds. So, you know, if he has something like middle pair or a draw or a gut shot, it's likely he calls a 2/3 pot size bet and a half pot size bet. So if you are c-betting, you're targeting very weak hands just to protect your fold equity here and get your fold equity right away. So I think you should size down, but I feel like checking the flop is an improvement on betting this flop, certainly. So Hero's flop reasoning reads, in retrospect, I prefer a check here. And this is really good because part of the way that you improve on Carrot Corner in any good poker forum is that you correct your past self. There's always a natural gap between the in-game thought process that you're capable of deploying with limited time, with monetary pressure, with other tables and decisions going on simultaneously, and the out-of-game thought process where you have all the time, you're relaxed, you're focused, you're not stressed, you can think through in great detail. Of course, there's a huge disconnect there, and the way you bridge it is by realizing what your in-game self is doing wrong that your out-of-game self wouldn't do, and then telling him not to do that again. Much like training a dog or something, like it doesn't really know why it's doing wrong. You have to tell it over and over again until it stops making that mistake. Like, the in-game self is mainly making decisions based on what's been committed to subconscious competence, like what is known very well, has been learned to a high enough degree that it can be applied quickly in that, like I said, small, lesser time, higher pressure environment. And so the out-of-game self is quite the contrast. You know, that's the guy that's got all the time in the world and is very methodical about it. And he should, you know, educate his in-game self as to what things he's frequently doing well and instill better habits into the subconscious so that the in-game game improves, basically. It will never improve as fast or at the same rate as the out-of-game understanding, but you want it to try to keep up as much as possible, and you don't want to neglect that. That's a slight detour, I'm digressing a bit, so I'll come back to the hand now. Hero also says, I think our hand does not turn well enough 3 ways in order to warrant a light c-bet, and I think that's absolutely true. I think that's great reasoning. I think Hero's picked up something there that's absolutely super relevant to the EV of the c-bet, and bear in mind, again, you do want that flop c-bet to be considerably plus EV to be better than checking. So given that when you get called you bloat a pot and your hand is turning like mediocre draws, it's not really turning anything, you're that happy about barreling, I mean, you're just not going to have that many good branches when you get called, and you will get called a lot here 3-way on this kind of texture. So he also says, plus the board hits our opponent's ranges harder than ours. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, we've opened the button and we have range advantage here. Like, sure, the small blind, if he was a tighter player, would probably have a higher concentration of Jack X and pocket pairs relative to us, probably just about, but we have the overpairs and he doesn't. We have the nut flush draw like ace king and ace queen and he doesn't. And also, like, the guy in the big blind should just be calling like loads of stuff for this min open for these pot odds. And so yeah, also just quick thing here, like, you're at 2NL pre-flop, you can see that one player is likely a fish. I would just 3x this button. It cuts back on multi-way pots like this one. It puts more money in there for you to c-bet and take down. It puts more money in there for you to utilize your positional advantage, to outplay weaker players, who they will be. I mean, this reg who's posting this hand is, you know, good enough not to be playing as low as 2NL, so he should be outclassing his competition pretty significantly here. So 3x is good. Use that positional I keep saying disadvantage. I think I'm just used to saying disadvantage. Use that positional advantage. Use that skill edge. And get fish heads up to yourself, basically. So size up pre, just jumping all over the hand once again. So coming back now to the flop, I think we can just finalize by saying that I think Hero's reasoning is correct, that we don't turn well enough to c-bet, and that's a really EV central point. I'm always drumming in that people need to think about EV and not random things that are not related to EV. But I don't agree that this board is better for our opponent's ranges than our range. I think range advantage, i.e. how well we connect here and how uncapped we are compared to them, is not as huge as it could be here, because they can have sets and 2 pairs just as we can, and good draws, but I think it's still considerable given that we have overpairs and they don't. I mean, okay, maybe some pocket pairs are a higher concentration of the small blind's range than ours, but then again, maybe small blind is just a huge fish who plays way too many hands and has a weaker range and more capped range than we do. So avoid that kind of old school error of assuming that the caller has a stronger range than the raiser because he has a bit like tighter requirements to call than he would to raise himself, like the gap concept, going back to Sklansky. Sure, his range is a little bit less capped at the bottom, but it's also a lot more capped at the top. Sorry, it's more capped at the bottom and more capped at the top. It's this more condensed range, basically. That doesn't make it stronger. It doesn't make it more advantageous range-wise for the pre-flop caller. It just means that there's a few less combos of absolute total air, but also way less combos of like nutted stuff and things like that. And the hands that are a higher concentration, like pocket pairs, like 8s and stuff, are really not a big deal. They're not super strong hands that we're that concerned about here when we have Queen 10, because we do have 2 overcards. We do have like lots of outs against them and can apply lots of pressure if they do call us on the flop. So lots to take in there about that flop. It's not as simple as it seems. I prefer a check, and so does Hero, but he bets. Remember your sizing there as well. Could be a bit smaller if you do bet. On the turn is the 7 of clubs, so the board is now Jack 7-6 with the 7 and 6 of diamonds, and then 7 of clubs on the turn. We have not picked up any extra equity. Small blind checks to us. He's the one that called us on the flop. Big blind folded to the flop, so we've got the suspected possible fish flatting us. And then you get a turn of the 7 of diamonds. Now, betting this turn is a really sizable mistake. Hero actually bets 8 into 14 here, which I think is verging on fairly massive a mistake. The reason is that, again, you're at 2NL. People are very stationary in this player pool, and Villain just looks to be the kind of player who's more likely than average to be a fish or to be an aggressive fish. Now, if he calls a c-bet on Jack 7-6 and no less a 4 into 6, big blind c-bets, or a fairly large c-bet on Jack 7-6 two-tone, the 7 comes on the turn, which changes nothing, scares nothing, provides no extra fold equity in the mind of a level 0 thinking fish, who, even if this guy is a reg, he's still likely not to be very good. He's playing 2-0 limit. No offense to anyone that plays at stake, but the majority of players, as I'm sure you've realized by now, are very bad at poker compared with you. If you're listening to this podcast, probably. Not guaranteeing you're a better player than the 2NL pool, but most of you guys listening here will be. So the point is that fold equity on non-texture changing cards just does not change very much against weak players or weak populations. And so when the other side of the coin, which is your fold equity, is equally dismal, I mean, you've literally got like 1 overcard to the board here. You've missed all your backdoor draws. You have very little way of improving. You can't really expect to triple happily on this kind of texture against this population on any runouts at all, really. So just basically give up now. You just have to check back here, try and bink a queen on the river or whatever and win the pot that way. It's the only real hope that you've got. So this bet of 8 into 14 on the Jack 7-6-7 with the Queen 10 after the flop's been called 3 ways by a weak population, by a member of said population who's more likely than average to be even weaker than the average population. Yeah, you just can't be bluffing here. You don't have enough of a cocktail of fold equity and pot equity. Let's have a look at Hero's turn thoughts. Having bet the flop, I think this is a pretty easy turn check. Yeah, so again, Hero here is just witnessing a massive disconnect between his in-game ability and his out-of-game ability, which is fine because he's a newer player and it's going to happen, and in-game you're going to make loads of mistakes, like I said before, and he's identifying them, and I bet that he's very unlikely to make these 2 mistakes with anywhere near as high a frequency in the future now that he's looked at flop and turn and said these were wrong. Like, it's just very unlikely he's going to play those streets like this again. More than like 1 time out of 7 or something like that. So, especially if he reinforces and revises his lessons. He also goes on to say, this card is unlikely to bring us more fold equity and does not grant us equity, so again agreeing with what the coach has said. I'd barrel on an ace, king or queen. Yeah, definitely, like when you get a scare card and extra equity, I mean the queen gives you a value hand obviously, so you're just value betting there. But when you get extra equity against a fairly likely fish, like you can go ahead and barrel as long as it's a scare card as well, and it scares away a lot of the second pair, under pair kind of stuff, weak draws, gut shots that the fish calls on the flop. He says, I thought about barreling an 8 or a 9. Well, an 8 or a 9 does improve your pot equity. It gives you a draw, but it also improves Villain's range considerably. He goes on to say, but I think since our fold equity is unlikely to increase on that card, that we can just check those back and hope to hit our gut shot, which isn't a diamond. So this is a really good example of very strong vacuum thinking out of game by Hero here. I mean, he's not formulating a balanced strategy, he's not thinking about how much he needs to bluff this turn, and nor should he, because he's almost certainly against a weaker player against whom he doesn't need to do that. So I think his reasoning is spot on, it's in a vacuum as it should be, and it's very good vacuum thinking. On the river, the Queen of Spades falls down after we get called on the turn, surprise, surprise. So the board is now Jack 7, 6, 7, Queen. Flush draw from the flop is bricked. We do have a 10 of diamonds blocker to that flush draw, making it slightly less likely in Villain's range, along with some straight draws as well. So what does Villain's range look like now? An average fish. I don't normally ask this question too much because I want people to think about their own range as well and not just try and soul read Villain. It's not always possible. But if you have to put an average fish on a range here, you can expect that he has a lot of draws that have now missed. Not loads, but certainly some ace-x of diamonds, king-x of diamonds, etc. It depends how wide he flats pre-flop, we really have no idea. But there are certainly missed flush draws in his range. The 10 of diamonds blocks some of those in our hand. Some missed straight draws as well, like 8-9, 4-5 perhaps, stuff like that. Jack-X is the most abundant thing by a mile before any action takes place on the river. And then there are some 7s that are trips, and there are some bigger hands like boats as well. Now, small blind donks out now for 43 big blinds and Hero folds. Now, ignore the fact that Hero's folded because we're going to look at this from point of decision. I actually think this is quite an interesting situation. If we had more info suggesting that Villain was definitely of the aggro fist variety, rather than just slightly more likely to be, I would definitely just snap here. Just because it's kind of hard to have a boat. A 7 is possible, but how many 7s do people flat out the small blind? Okay, a fish does flat more, so you can give them like ace 7 off and king 7 off and stuff, then they start to be abundant. But most players who have a more snug pre-flop game won't have too many trips here, and like fish do spew here with Mistras, they do spew here with a jack, but given that we don't know that Villain is of the aggro fish variety, I think it's a little bit too likely that this population just does this as a value line, like calling flop, calling turn, then just donking river. Also, our 10 blocker is really bad. It blocks like 10-9 and 10-8, which are missed straight draws. It blocks any flush draw containing the 10 of diamonds, so it just makes hands such as like ace 7, king 7, 7-8, pocket 6s, pocket jacks a bit more abundant. Jack 7 full house makes these hands more abundant than they would otherwise be because we block the other part of his range, i.e. his bluffs. To call a 43 big blind bet here, you're going to need, well, we can do amount to call divided by amount to call plus total pot. We know from our milestones that to call a pot size bet in an end of action spot, you need 33% equity. So we know it's going to be a bit bigger than that, like in the sort of mid to high 30s probably. 43 into 30, so to figure that out you can go 43, which is the amount to call, into 43 plus 73, which is the pot after Villain has bet, so it's amount to call divided by amount to call plus total pot. So that means that you're going to be dividing your 43 into 116, and that will give you your required equity. So we can go ahead and actually just bring up a calculator and do that now. Apologies for YouTube viewers with my Mac sprawling its icons all over the screen while I find the calculator. So what did we say there? 43 into 116, right? This is basically your pot odds. So 37%, as we predicted. I mean, it's a waste of time to need to do that in-game. Rather, it's much better just to be like, okay, 33% is the target if he bet pot. He bet a bit over pot, so it's going to be a bit higher, like 35 to 38%. If you get it in that vicinity, you know, the fact it's 37%, that's fine. You know your target now. Are you good 37% of the time here? I suspect not, but I suspect you probably are just about if you know that Villain is more aggressive. So overall here, to summarize this hand, also just really quickly on the river, you don't need to go into thinking about where you are in your range, I don't think, because, I mean, the flop was called multi-way, turn was called, and then a massive overbet on the river. I mean, it just is a strong line from the population. I think you've got enough info there that you don't need to try and play in a balanced way. You should probably just look to overfold your range and just play hands in vacuums and try to work out whether or not you should call here based on the vacuum factors that you have, because they are quite, there's quite a decent bit of information here, even though you don't know anything about Villain, just population in line. And the fact the flop was multi-way have given you enough info here to fold, I think. So just don't worry about how much of your river range you're folding here. You're probably folding a reasonable amount of it if you're folding a queen, but that's okay. So I would fold river. So in summary, 3x pre-flop because there's likely fish in the blinds and you're at 2NL where people don't 3-bet you enough. On the flop, you should definitely check because although c-betting small might be slightly plus EV, it's probably not as high EV as checking. And we're thinking in a vacuum because we're against weaker players. On the turn, never ever bet here because the turn changes the texture, not at all. It adds no pot equity, nor fold equity, therefore it's bad. On the river, we've got enough of a population read, I think, to determine that we're not going to meet our 37% target, and we should be folding to that river bet. Okay guys, this has been Characters for the Carrot Poker Podcast. That's the end of today's section. I did one hand instead of two because it was a really cool hand with loads of detail. I'll do another hand next time, and stay in touch with me, leave me feedback, get in touch if you want coached. admin@carrotcorner.com is my email address, or check out carrotcorner.com for information on coaching, my book, and all of that stuff. Thanks very much for listening, and see you guys on the next one. Run good at the tables, thanks.